Welcome back, everyone, to Diary of an Empath. Okay, you guys, I have to admit that I have been on a little bit of a hiatus, not by choice. It's just been a crazy amount of things that have been happening in the last couple months. And I've had to allow myself to give myself permission that it's okay to do a rerun and it's okay to slow down. And that's essentially what I've been doing. I got a major injury in my hip and I've had back-to-back things going on. Then I caught COVID and it's just been nonstop for me. And big news, I left my federal job, which is a big step for me, to be a full-time entrepreneur and now to be doing my podcast full-time and focusing on my private practice and still doing my readings and my spiritual work. So that is my excuse. So thank you guys for being understanding and just continuing to show up every single week, despite the fact that I've had to do a couple reruns of episodes. I love you guys. And I so appreciate the fact that you're still listening. And I know you're still listening because I see the stats. So it hasn't moved, which means you guys are still listening. So thank you for hanging in there with me. And I promise we're going to have some exciting new guests and episodes now that I have some more time and energy to dedicate. With that being said, today's episode, I want to focus on emotional dysregulation. This is something that I love and I specialize in. I work a lot with borderline personality disorder. And just because you have emotional dysregulation does not mean you have BPD. A lot of us have emotional dysregulation at some point in our lives when we have stress or when we're going through a breakup or when something's going on that causes us to get dysregulated, like a trigger or past trauma. So not everybody who has emotional dysregulation at times struggles with something major like a personality disorder, and some do. But I really want to focus this episode on anyone who struggles with emotional dysregulation and tools and strategies that you can use, especially in the moment, or to cope ahead so that way you can deal with it as best as you can. One of the biggest things that I explain to people is that we have what's called a window of tolerance, meaning that if you wake up one day and you have a great day, you do your meditation, you do your journaling, you don't check your phone, you're starting at a baseline of about a 0 or a 1. And so if you have a stressful event that happens that day, you have enough support in your nervous system to probably be able to handle that stress and stay regulated throughout that day and during that time of stress. Now, let's just say you wake up the same day and you wake up in a shitstorm. Your kids are coming in the room, you get into a fight with your spouse, you're checking social media, you didn't get sleep the following night, you are really stressed out at the beginning of your day. And let's say you start your day off at like a solid 4 or 5, and then something happens. You get upset at work, you get into a fight with your spouse, something happens to where now, because you're at a 5 or a 6 at your baseline starting out that day, that window of tolerance starts to shut. And what happens when the pressure builds? It's like a volcano or a pressure cooker. Eventually, that energy is going to come out and that energy is going to explode. Now, sometimes the opposite can happen. When that explosion happens, some people, instead of externally becoming emotionally dysregulated, they internalize it and they shut down completely. And what I always tell people about your nervous system is meant to keep you alive. If we didn't have it, we wouldn't have survived, right? So that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn component is there to keep you safe. However, sometimes your nervous system doesn't really know when there's a real active threat, like somebody's pointing a gun at you, or the difference between when you get into a fight with your spouse. So when that nervous system is activated and you don't have that support system to keep yourself regulated at a 1 or a 2 from the beginning of the day, it can feel really big. And we might have explosions. We may have anger that comes out, yelling. Sometimes in the severe end, some people may have self-harm, and some people may internalize everything and completely shut down and not know what to say, not know how to talk, not know how to express their feelings. And so you can have these very opposite ends of the spectrum. And the goal, especially when you're trying to emotionally regulate, is to find balance. How do we find the middle path with that? Right? So maybe it doesn't have to be internalizing all the way, and maybe it doesn't have to be externalizing all the way, but how do we find the middle path so that way you're able to express your feelings, you're able to not get to a point where you're completely blowing up at your spouse. And maybe that might look like taking some steps, taking a step back, taking some time to cool off. And those are some of the strategies that we are going to go over. Now, why do people have emotional dysregulation? So sometimes it can start with vulnerabilities that we have when we start out our day. So lack of sleep. Do we support our nervous system when we wake up? Did we eat? Are we sick? Did something happen first thing in the morning? Did something happen the day before? Sometimes it's also past trauma. So trauma can manifest itself in really, really weird ways that we don't expect. We can have triggers, right? So if you grew up in a household where yelling was the norm, and maybe you learned how to shut down when yelling happened. Maybe you learned how to yell back when yelling happened because that was what you were familiar with. And then something happens to trigger that emotional response. Maybe your spouse starts to get a little elevated with their voice. Maybe your kid is having a meltdown and they're elevating their voice. And that trigger may cause an emotional response. Maybe that emotional response is to shut down. Maybe that emotional response is to yell back. So sometimes our triggers and our traumas can be a variable as to why we have an emotional response or have dysregulation that happens. Now, while everybody experiences dysregulation at times, it can be more prevalent with certain mental health conditions, such as borderline personality disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder. Again, when we're taking a history of trauma and we've learned how to survive, and that probably worked during that traumatic experience, but your nervous system doesn't always know when to say like, hey, you know what? You're actually safe now. You don't have to respond in these ways. And at the end of the day, I'm always going to ask what's effective for you. Right? That may have been effective when you were 5, 6, 7, maybe even a teenager. But now as an adult, if you continue to respond like that, if you continue to shut down, if you continue to yell or express anger instead of how you're actually feeling and what you need, that's probably not going to be the effective thing to get you a healthy relationship or to be able to have sustainable friendships, right? So the things that were effective when you were not safe may not be effective anymore now that you're safe, but you're triggered. Now, there are certain situations where you may not be safe. It could be an abusive situation. And of course, your nervous system is going to respond to that. But for the sake of this conversation, we're really focusing on emotional regulation in situations that are non-abusive. And I also want to point out that there are times when people have emotional dysregulation that are abusive in nature. It doesn't mean that they're intentionally trying to be abusive, but it can be manipulative. It can be abusive in nature, especially if it's doing something to get the needs met at the expense of someone else's safety. Here's what I always tell people, and here's what I tell my clients. Let's say we're looking at it from a scale of 1 to 10. If you notice that you're starting to get elevated, and what it feels like at a 5 or a 6 is maybe your heart rate starts to get elevated, maybe you start to get sweaty, maybe you start to have racing thoughts, maybe you start to have thoughts that are indicative of self-harm. That's when I want you to really be mindful of how you're feeling in the moment. What am I feeling? How am I feeling? And what are my urges right now? If it's not effective for you, or you cannot solve the problem, this is when I want you to just stop. Stop and walk away if you need to until you can get back into a state that you can think clearly. Because here's what happens when you get emotionally dysregulated. The part of the brain that uses analytics, language, and mindful thinking is that frontal part of your brain, the frontal lobe. And when we are in a fight or flight response system, our amygdala, which is near the back of the brain, the limbic system, that fight or flight emotional response of the brain is lit up like a Christmas tree, and your frontal lobe goes offline. Think about it like this. If a bear is coming at you, you don't have time to think about, should I go left? Should I go right? What should I eat for dinner tonight? No, your frontal part of your brain shuts down, and the part of your brain that needs to keep you alive, that fight or flight response, that emotional response that can act impulsively and quickly, it lights up because it needs to keep you alive. That is your survival mechanism. It's one of the oldest parts of the brain for a reason. However, your body doesn't always know the difference between a bear coming at you and getting into a fight with your spouse. So if that frontal part of your brain is completely shut down, you cannot have a conversation about what your needs are. You're not listening to your partner about what their needs are. So this is why if you're part of the brain that is shutting down when you are completely in an emotional mindset, this is when I just want you to stop, walk away. Don't answer that text message right away. Go take some time to do some deep breaths. Go take some time to finish thinking about what it is that you want to do. And is this effective for me? Did you guys know that I'm not only a therapist, but I'm also a coach and a professional tarot reader? Now, it's not exactly me hovering over a crystal ball telling your future. It's a way to connect with your guides on life issues such as career and love and spirituality. And sometimes people need one-on-one coaching to help them through breakups, toxic relationships, healing the mother wound, their spiritual path, or navigating tools as an empath. So I do all of these things to help my clients pursue life and decisions and understand themselves. So if you are interested in one-on-one coaching or a tarot reading, click the link below to get started. Okay, back to the podcast. If you can solve the problem, great, solve the problem. But if you cannot solve the problem, or if it's not effective for you, then go do something that's the complete opposite of what the urge is. So for example, let's just say that you're getting into a fight with your partner and you're texting, and your urge is to call and yell at your partner or send these long paragraphs of why they're wrong and why you're right. So if it's not effective in the moment to solve the problem because you're not listening and your partner's not listening, or if it's just not solvable in that moment, then the opposite of that would look like taking a step back, not texting paragraphs, not calling right away, and waiting until you can get into a more rational mindset, think clearly about what your needs are, and calm down your nervous system, because that front part of your brain that you need for language and analytics and to think clearly is not working properly. And that's not your fault. That's the thing that people need to understand, is that the way that your brain and body are functioning is not your fault. A lot of times we have trauma, we have triggers. And again, this kept us safe when we were kids, when we were teenagers. It maybe got us through really, really traumatic events. Sometimes disassociation, sometimes the nervous system will be in fight or flight, and that kept you safe. But now, if that's not effective for you and that's not working, you have to figure out ways to regulate your nervous system and then come back to the situation. Because otherwise, you may find yourself in these repetitive patterns that are causing friendships to not last, relationships to not last, people not wanting to be your friend, your partner not understanding your needs, maybe you not even understanding your own needs. So where you start is regulating your nervous system. I also want to talk about biological factors, because a lot of people do not think of the fact that a lot of times we have this DNA that's passed down through generations called epigenetics, and trauma can literally be passed down to us. And based off of the research, it shows that we think that it can be passed down within about 3 generations, like within our DNA cells. And the reason why is because if grandma was in a war and there was barely any food available, right? And there was a lot of this trauma that was going on. And let's say she was pregnant with mom. Well, that DNA is now being passed down to mom. And as her ovaries are being formed, that DNA is being passed into her ovaries. So now when mom has you, that DNA was already being stored in the ovaries. And now you are now getting that DNA, which sometimes we are learning that it can affect weight. It can be why some people have a harder time losing weight. It can be why people are more reactive emotionally. Because again, if that is passed to our DNA, which helps us survive, then that might be reasons why you're more prone to emotional dysregulation, why you're more prone to weight gain, why you're more prone to not being able to gain weight, why you're more prone to health factors. There's so many things with biological markers that we're still learning that can also contribute to why we're more responsive or why we're more emotionally dysregulated. I also want to point out the fact that, listen, for some of you fire signs out there, and, for those of you that are into astrology, I'm very spiritual. So I do think that some of us just come into this lifetime more spicy and more quick to react. And I think that a lot of us that are born like that, and then you sprinkle in a little bit of trauma, you sprinkle in a little bit of dysfunctional relationships, then yeah, we can be more emotionally responsive. So especially you Leos out there, you Aries, I love you guys. I love you because I know some of you I've worked with. I love Aries, but man, when you're dysregulated and you're upset, it can be spicy. It can be a lot. So some of you, I think, are naturally just like that. So you have to even put more intention on regulation and what that looks like. And again, there's nothing wrong with being passionate. Some people are just naturally passionate, but there's a difference when it's not effective for you and it's not working for you with your goals and what you need. So if you tell me, Keresse, I want a healthy functioning relationship and I want close friendships, but every time you get pissed off, you either shut down or you yell at your partner or your friends, you're probably not going to have long-lasting close friendships and relationships because you're pushing them away, or they don't know how you feel because you're shutting down. So that's not working for you. If you're passionate, that's fine, right? You can express yourself. You can say like, I'm really feeling frustrated right now. That's okay. But are you communicating that? Are you listening to what your partner needs? Are you understanding your own needs before you communicate? Those are the things that I really want you guys to think about. I also want to bring up cultural expectations and societal expectations, because there are some cultures that expect women, especially, to not say anything, to just be quiet, keep your mouth shut, don't say shit, right? Because that is the norm. Women in some cultures are expected to just do their wifely duties, have kids, cook, keep the house clean, don't talk back to your husband, and be easy. Don't talk about your needs, because if you talk about your needs, you're complaining. And if you're complaining, then you're difficult. And who wants to be with a difficult woman? So I really want to be mindful of the fact that that exists too. We live in a society where there's a lot of misogyny and there's a patriarchy, and that patriarchy has not been disassembled. We're still fighting the patriarchy. And so by speaking up, you're considered a bitch, right? By speaking up, you're considered difficult. But there's a difference between being confident, being secure, being someone who expresses themselves, being someone who has boundaries. There's a difference between that than somebody who cannot regulate their emotions. And so their emotions are either like on the extreme end or completely shutting down. Again, how do we find balance? How do we find that middle path with what works for you and what works for your relationships? Okay, so I'm going to give you guys some tips on what you can do when you're dysregulated in the moment. One tip is literally called tip. So there's a couple ways to do this, but I'm going to teach you guys something called the dive reflex. And I'll probably do another video that shows you exactly how this works. But for now, I'm going to explain it. So what the dive reflex is there's something with the nerve, the vagus nerve, that when you are able to put on ice on the eyes or some kind of cold compress on the eyes and hold your breath at the same time, don't pass out while doing this. This triggers the dive reflex, which automatically will bring your heart rate down very quickly. I've tried it. It works. You can be in the 120s and go down to 75 very quickly. So when you're in the middle of a panic attack, or you're wanting to self-harm, or you're in this emotional state where it's really hard to regulate, go get yourself an ice pack, go get a bag of peas, put it on your eyes, hold your breath for a couple seconds, deep breathe, do it again, repeat. Now, tip can also look like really intense exercise. It can look like paced breathing, muscle relaxation, meditation. But if you really want to hit that dive reflex, you have to be able to hold your breath and put the ice or ice pack or something cold on the eyes. Splashing water on the face, all that is great. That's a very good grounding exercise, but it's not the dive reflex. So that's one thing you guys can do. Another thing is just called stop. It is stop sign. Just like when you feel yourself getting to a solid 7 and that emotional regulation, that window of tolerance is closing, where you're about to explode like a fucking volcano, stop sign. Stop what you're doing. Don't respond. Don't continue. Don't engage. Leave the room. Go take a break. Go outside. Go for a walk. When you can get to a point and you can ask yourself these questions: can I solve the problem? And is this effective for me right now? If you can't solve it and it's not effective, go distract yourself. If you can solve it, come back and solve it when you're regulated. These are the really key things I want you to keep in mind. Managing emotions is really, really hard for some people. You may have not been given the skills or the tools or been modeled what that looks like. If your parents modeled dysregulation and that was the norm, it's going to be really hard. It's like starting over. You're teaching yourself and you're reparenting yourself on what's proper emotions and what does that look like and what's effective and what's not. Maybe I shouldn't be yelling at work. Maybe I shouldn't be always yelling at my spouse. But if that's what mom and dad did, that's what's familiar. And we tend to gravitate towards what we know. But again, if it's not working for you and it's not effective, you have to do something different, because otherwise you are in the cycle of insanity, which is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. And there has to be a level of accountability that we have to take if we are scaring people off, or if we're not having really healthy relationships because we can't manage our own triggers. I'm going to say something that's a little difficult to hear, but it's not other people's responsibility to manage our triggers. It's not. And it's not their responsibility to tiptoe over our triggers like it's a fucking minefield and them anticipating for a mine to just go off and a bomb to go off. That's actually really traumatic for some other people that can be in our lives, right? And we're going to push people away if we do that. So if you're listening and this resonates for you, I also want to point out resources. Therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy can be wonderful with emotional regulation. It's not just for people with borderline personality disorder. And a lot of the tips that I was just giving come from DBT work. So if you find a therapist that specializes in DBT, that is my baby. I love DBT. It works and it's really, really good for behavior change. There's also a lot of self-help DBT groups on Facebook, DBT books and workbooks that you can use. Meditation is great, mindfulness, getting outside, re-regulating your nervous system. And I have a ton of episodes on that. So many resources that are out there. And of course, you guys can always reach out to me if you have any questions or if you need help in the right direction to like, where do I go? I hope that this was helpful for you guys. I promise you that I will be more consistent with the show. I'm kind of getting back on track. And as always, if you guys need anything, I have so much love for you. Thank you for continuing to show up and not giving up on the show and just continuing to support. And just stay tuned because we got a lot of stuff coming up and a lot of exciting guests. So thank you so much and tune in next time on the next episode of Diary of an Empath.